This talk is coming out in a different version, I should say, in a special issue of Victorian Literature and Culture. It's their relaunch issue, and they asked a lot of people to write a brief piece about a keyword. So my piece is about Britain. And I should say that unlike Caroline's wonderfully subtle and complex talk, this is a polemic. It's full of broad, sweeping statements, hopefully controversial, and hopefully open to critique and to challenge. And I feel that this is a talk where I should also say something quite explicit about my own subject position, because as of 5 a.m. on the morning after the Brexit referendum, I am a member of the Scottish Nationalist Party. And I would probably also support the unification of Ireland. And since I was brought up as an Ulster Unionist, and then I spent over a decade in Oxford and Cambridge, which we can all agree are the most English of English institutions, this is quite a shift. Once I definitely considered myself British, and I would write that very firmly on every form. Now I don't feel so sure about that. And once I definitely would have said that I was a scholar of British Victorian literature and culture. But after the last 5 years spent working in Scottish studies, a discipline which has had extraordinarily little dialogue with Victorian studies, I'm not sure about that either, because when I think, for instance, about my first two monographs, they're not about British Victorian literature and culture, they're about England. I don't think I discuss any writers who weren't primarily based in London, often in Oxford or Cambridge, or within about 100 miles of that region. Maybe a brief excursus to the Isle of Wight with Tennyson or Italy with the Brownings, but that's about as far as it goes. I say Victorian religion in the title of one of my books, but I don't talk about Scotland at all. In fact, I'm basically talking about the Church of England, and I say almost nothing explicit about that choice. So in recent years, the field of Victorian literature and culture has seen, as we all know, really crucial transformative work on global Victorian studies, on world Victorianism, on transnational, transatlantic, transcultural, cosmopolitan Victorian studies. But I do wonder whether in looking outwards, and often when we're looking outwards to the rest of the world, we are imaginatively located in London, we haven't looked up, down, or over to the left enough to think about the complexities of what is going on within Britain and the different kinds of regional, local, provincial or national identities happening there. So my questions are really, how many works of scholarship are published each year in which we say we're studying Victorian literature and culture? And this talk, I should say, is not so much about the discipline of history, in which I think the different perspectives could be taken on the issues I'm describing, but how many works using Victorian literature, Victorian culture, are actually about England, not about Britain? And are we in danger in our field of reproducing a clustering of our scholarly efforts and our research and our teaching towards London and the south of England? So to answer these questions, I did some really not at all empirical or methodologically sound or quantitative research, but I thought it would be interesting just to do a bit of exploration and see if what I found backed up what I'm saying. So although this looks impressive, I should say they're all kind of problems of what I was doing here, but I was simply running a keyword search to see what comes up when you pair the word Victorian with the 4 nations. So what you get, I've got the figures here, is 657 publications tagged Victorian in England, 328 Victorian in Britain, 60 Victorian in Ireland, 31 for Victorian in Scotland, and 23 for Victorian and Wales. And out of interest, I then put in India and London as comparisons. So what you see there is that works tagged with Victorian and India, they outweigh by quite a margin everything tagged Ireland, Scotland and Wales. And works tagged Victorian London outweigh by more than 3 times works tagged with Wales, Ireland and Scotland. Because I wondered whether people who work on Ireland, Scotland and Wales tended to use 19th century as a qualifier rather than Victorian, I ran that as well. It does make a little bit of a difference, but you still get this huge chunk on 19th century London. And actually I didn't look in depth into Ireland and Wales, but in Scotland the word 19th is more complicated because you're getting everything on Sir Walter Scott James Hogg. So you're basically getting early 19th century Scotland, which is an extensively studied period, unlike Scotland post 1830. I did a bit of searching by adjective as well. English doesn't work as a qualifier there. Obviously, what this is bringing up is people, authors, who are tagged as Scottish or Irish or Welsh. So that's why you get a larger set of results there. But again, it's bringing up, you know, all the works on somebody like Robert Louis Stevenson, and many of those works are not really concerned with Stevenson being Scottish or in any extensive way with Scotland. I then did some even more subjective research by just looking at the last 5 years of publications in some of the leading Victorian journals, and by asking my friends who work in Irish history and Scottish literature and Irish history at Strathclyde and elsewhere. But all this did produce the same impression. And that impression is that when it comes to 19th century Ireland, things are looking quite healthy, and in fact as though work in that field is on the rise. So Ireland and Victorian literature, there have been a number of recent book-length publications, including, just as examples, Tina O'Toole's The Irish New Woman, Matthew Campbell's Irish Poetry Under the Union. I find it amusing that, as far as I know, Matthew Campbell and myself are kind of two of the few people from Northern Ireland in Victorian studies. We both started working in Tennyson, and now I work in Scotland and he works on Ireland. We kind of moved away, but Matt's Irish Poetry Under the Union, excellent book. Christina Morin and Niall Gillespie's edited collection Irish Gothic. And there's a lot of exciting revisionary work going on in 19th century Irish history, including really big books like K. Theodore Hoppin's excellent Governing Hibernia, and a number of others. Wales, I must say, is a bit out of my field of expertise, but I could find very little. So if anybody knows otherwise, tell me afterwards. All I'm really aware of is a good book, which I think is now well over 10 years old, by Catherine Brennan on Welsh women poets. And there is a new study, Wyn Thomas's The Nations of Wales, 1890 to 1914. Again, that's coming in right at the end of the period, and it's not a literary study. And in the field I do know, Scottish Victorian studies, in as much as that exists, which frankly it doesn't, there have again been signs of change. There's been a new edited collection on Scotland and the British Empire, focusing very much on the Victorian period. There's a literary collection, Scotland in the 19th century world, and there are a lot of really, really good young scholars actually coming through, often in the Scottish university system, who are trying to get monographs out on Victorian Scotland. But at this present moment, there only are 2 monographs that actually deal with the literature of Victorian Scotland as a whole. William Donaldson's Popular Literature in Victorian Scotland from 1986, and a very good book on Kailyard fiction by Andrew Nash. The William Donaldson book, incidentally, Popular Literature in Victorian Scotland, it's a really good example of what I'm trying to say here, because if that book were called Popular Literature in Victorian Britain, which why should it not be, we would all have heard of it. Who's read William Donaldson's book here? Yeah, but if that had been its title, that would have been up there with Martha Vicinus, Louis James. It would have been a classic, canonical, vital, formative part of our understanding of Victorian popular literature, newspaper culture in the period, dialect writing in the period. I myself had never heard of William Donaldson or this book before I started reading works about Victorian Scotland. So it's not that I'm necessarily saying this is a balance that we really urgently need to redress. I'm more saying that this is perhaps something that we need to recognise and interrogate more. And I wanted very briefly to discuss the essay that I found most important in thinking through these concerns, which is Caroline Levine's excellent and important 2013 essay, From Nation to Network. And Caroline points out, and I entirely agree with this, that although a lot of work has been done on refusing the national frame, when we discuss Britain and British writers in our works, we often don't explain why we have made that choice. And that is correct. She asked us to think about why Britain should especially matter in Victorian studies. And she asked us not to assume that the notion that all Victorian writers are born in Britain should go unrecognised. So this is important, and I agree. However, this essay is interesting because I also have 2 very significant disagreements with it. And one of them is that throughout the essay, Caroline assumes that there is such a thing as the British national frame and that that is unproblematic. When she talks about authors born in Britain, I think to myself, you know, you're thinking about Britain as an entity. If you were a Welsh coal miner writing songs in Welsh, did you think of yourself as British born? If you were a Highland Gaelic poet like Mora Mór na Nóran, writing political anti-landlord verse, is British really the right way to describe you? And when Caroline looks in a very transformative way at networks and flows of literary production and consumption, London is her centre. But what would those networks look like if Cardiff were your centre, or Glasgow were your centre, or even Bolton, or say Falmouth? How would that change our sense of what's going on in these flows? And the other thing I think is interesting is that this actually reads really differently in 2018 than in 2013. So fast are things moving, because Caroline's argument is profoundly against the idea of nationalism and is in fact explicitly arguing that as Victorianists it is kind of our civic duty to resist nationalism. But I can tell you that if you're reading this from within a humanities department in a Scottish university, it does not read in quite the same way. So I wanted to turn to my own area to exemplify a couple of the complexities I'm talking about in these national identities, and just look very, very quickly at one poem. This is a poem from the anthology that was mentioned earlier. And it's a poem about British imperial battle, in fact, against Egyptian nationalism in 1882. And George Bruce, who is a kind of self-made man in St Andrews, was very agitated by the fact that all the newspapers had emphasised that it was the Highland Regiment that had won the battle, bore the battle's brunt. Here he cites newspaper reports. But that it had been reported at the same time as an English victory. And in the preface to his volume, in which he later collected this, he explicitly says that he's angry about the present fashion of falsifying history and geography by substituting England for Great Britain and Ireland. So interestingly, a lot of people in the 19th century are concerned with really the reverse of what I've been saying, as in I'm saying too often we say Britain, but we mean England, whereas for a lot of Scottish people in the period, in the 19th century, they were really concerned that people were saying England when what they should have been saying was Britain. So this poem starts out by separating Scotland and Britain. Turkey knew as metter match, Scotland sent her Isle Black Watch, order in the east to patch tartan on the Nile. Scotch rebellion made a stand, Britain halted on the sand, waiting for the kilts to land. So there's a quite clear separation between the British forces and the Scottish, the manly kilt-wearing Scottish forces coming along to rescue them. Scotland marched onto the front. Scotland conquered Caledonian style. But then the poem interestingly goes on to argue that what's exemplified here is that the Scots are more British than the British. And in fact, they are the best of Britain. And that's why they should never be left out through the use of the term England. Tel Keber only tells Britain's soul in Scotland dwells. So although this poem may start out looking a little bit like Scottish nationalism, actually it exemplifies what historian Graham Morton calls unionist nationalism, a very, very common attitude in Victorian Scotland. This poem was published in the People's Journal, and that's interesting as well because the People's Journal as a newspaper exemplifies what's going on here, which is a local perspective and often using the Scots language, which is writing about something national or international, which is very widely circulated. The People's Journal is one of the most read newspapers, along with its sister magazine, The People's Friend, in the Victorian period and across the Victorian world. Millions of readers. And this is, of course, exemplified by its presence on Fleet Street in London. So this isn't even a kind of symbolic representation of Scottish popular culture at the heart of Victorian London. It's a literal representation, and I imagine the building was specifically designed to that end. And again, Dundee really is, as Hugh MacDiarmid once wrote, the great home and fostering centre of popular literature. But how many of us, if asked, you know, to design a course in Victorian popular literature would immediately think Dundee is what we should be discussing in this classroom, but it is what you should be discussing. Scottish popular culture, as we know, circulated all over the world, particularly through forms of music and song, particularly, as many scholars have examined, through the works of Walter Scott and Robert Burns. These are just a couple of little examples. Peter Taylor, a Paisley-born engineer, hearing the Egyptian band at the pyramids playing Scots music. And David Kennedy, he's one of the Kennedy singers. They were a really internationally famous group of performers, a family who went around the world doing their show Twa Hours at Hame, their Scottish songs show. Two of them died, and this was a huge incident because they were such celebrities. Two of them died in the fire in, I think it was the Venice Opera House later on. But this was from their tour of Australia and New Zealand, where in the outback farmers start producing their books of Scottish music and singing Burns. And I especially like this little moment in New Zealand where they lift up the New York Herald, again a paper we might think is central and integral to 19th century culture, and underneath is the Northern Ensign of Wick, another kind of exemplar of the reach of the provincial press, the British and the Scottish provincial press in the Victorian world. And I think we don't simply underestimate the spread of the forms of Scottish and indeed Irish popular culture around the world. We underestimate how popular those were in England. I think we should recognise that the Victorians had a far greater understanding, for instance, of the Scots language than we do. Not just because they grew up reading Walter Scott, and Walter Scott is quite hard for students now, as many of you have perhaps found, in terms of the Scots dialect, but also because if you wanted to perform songs to your family or in the parlour or in a professional capacity, you needed to be able to sing in Scots. In London, at most points in the mid-19th century onwards, you could go and see a specifically Scottish play because this was in itself a popular genre. You could go to a music hall where Scotch comedian was emerging as a particular kind of performer. You could go to a show of Scottish song. You would see characters speaking Scots in all kinds of performances and plays and venues, even if the production itself was not badged as Scottish, though it often was. When I get round, I don't know when I'll get round to this, and hopefully by the time I do it will be redundant, but when I get round to writing my big book about how Scottish popular culture took over the Victorian world and how we haven't really noticed this, I'm going to call it Local All Over the World, after this wonderful quote from Blackwoods, another, of course, exemplar of the reach of Scotland in the Victorian period, by Christopher North, when in a dialogue, one character says to him, "We can't insert this joke in Blackwoods because it's all about Glasgow and Scots. London readers will say, this is too local." And he responds, "Our ambition is that our wit shall be local all over the world." So I'll conclude by saying that though I do strongly feel that relevance is a dangerous concept in academia, in any field, I also think that at the moment we can quite clearly see that there's a lot of discussion about Britishness going on, and that discussion is profoundly informed in quite alarming ways by Victorian history and by a kind of popular understanding of Britain's status in the Victorian period. And therefore, perhaps as Victorianists, this is a good time for us to think harder about what it means or what it meant to be British in the Victorian period, and about where Scotland, Ireland, Wales, not to mention the north of England and other regions of Britain. And I did read a great article arguing that there's not 4 nations, there's 5, because Cornwall should, of course, be considered as a separate nation. But I think we need to think about where these 4 or 5 or more national identities might sit within Britain, and to be aware of that in our own scholarship. Thank you.